And when we talk about facilities, don't everyone glaze over. It's compelling and interesting, I promise you here. Go back to the first one. And so along with Eric Brunner from University of Connecticut, we looked at financing school facilities, public school facilities in California over the last 10 years. And we actually go all the way back to 1998. And the reason that we do that is because the state of California established a very moderately robust state aid program for school construction and modernization, so the brick and mortar of schools, back in 1998. And that structure, called the School Facility Program, or the SFP, is largely in place today. It's had a lot of legislative tweaks over the last 20 or so years, but it's largely in place today. And unfortunately, the punchline of our study is that we found wide funding disparities by property wealth. And of course, we look at property wealth because that's the way in which local school districts tap into facility funding or capital facility funding, and I'll say more about that in a second. We find wide funding disparities by household income, and we find wide funding disparities by student background. Namely, we look at unduplicated pupils. And the result is really a relatively regressive finance system for school facilities in California, which, I mean, in our opinion, was fairly out of sync with the progress that's been made on the LCFF front. So just as a bit of context so that the findings will make sense, I'm assuming most of you don't think about school facility funding too often unless you're forced to. But the School Facility Program, as I said, started in 1998, and between then and last year, it awarded about $42 billion in grants to school districts across the state of California for both new construction and modernization. And there's really two buckets of money that the state hands out: new construction and modernization, right? And so new construction, you qualify if you could show you have enrollment growth and what's called unhoused students. And modernization, of course, is different. That's, you know, the thousands of schools that we have. And if the classrooms are 25 years old and have not received state aid for renovating them in the last 25 years, they again qualify for what's called modernization funding or renovation, whatever the term you might want to use. And modernization has a pretty wide definition in terms of what you can actually do with those dollars. But and the state match on these in these two buckets is in new construction, the state matches local funds 50-50. So the state provides 50%, the locals raise the other 50% on new construction. And this is something that's fundamentally different between capital construction and modernization than it is, say, on LCFF or school district operating budgets, right? Is the whole state system is predicated on a local match. So local districts have to raise dollars in order to access state funds primarily. There's a small hardship component, which I can mention, but by and large, it is a state matching program really set up to incentivize local voters to tax themselves or go into debt to pay for school construction and modernization. So on the modernization side, the state actually matches local dollars on a 60-40. So the state is kicking in 60% of eligible costs, locals 40. You know, as Susanna Loeb mentioned early on, the school facility program is largely a first come, first served state aid program. So if you, as a school district, find that you have eligibility for new construction or modernization grants based on the criteria, you basically put together a project, you get in line to the state to ask for funds. And you will get funds assuming that the state program has money, right? So the state program is funded by statewide school construction bonds. And there was one, the last one was in 2016 on the ballot, but the previous one, the last one before that was 2006. So a long gap in money that became available. And what's important to note here is that these dollars for capital construction and modernization are entirely separate from operating dollars, entirely separate from LCFF dollars. So they're not connected, they're not predicated on them, they're not really necessarily in relationship to them. So they don't affect them in that way. And to understand how school districts raise their share, they really do it in three ways. or how they raise dollars, I guess, to do new construction or modernization. Mainly local, the number one source is local general obligation bonds. I'm sure all of you have voted on these in the school district that you happen to live in. They're usually for multiple $100 million, depending on what the project is. State aid from the school facility program then would be the next category, which is statewide bonds. And then a big chunk has been developer fees. So if developers are building homes or other buildings in the area, there are rules around the developer fees that can be paid to the school district, basically to house the students that are assumed to be created by those projects. And just as a kind of quick aside is that, you know, when you're looking at facilities and facility spending by districts, it really fluctuates from year to year. But one thing to understand about it is that if you're a school district and you own, I don't know, 50 schools and you have probably 80 buildings on those 50 schools, some of which might have been built in 1922, some of which might have been built in 2012, and everything in between. It's really, so you're spending various amounts of money based on what you can raise and based on what kind of your needs are that are going on. But districts spend on their facilities, of course, through their capital budget, which is what I've been describing, which is really, you know, it tends to be debt issuances and other things to do major modernizations, what might be called capital renewals, replace a roof, these sort of larger things, or build an entirely new school, or demolish a school and rebuild it. Some have done that. But they also spend on their facilities under what's called maintenance and operations. Again, not a sexy term, but those things go for utilities, custodial, security, minor repairs, and those monies do come out of the LCFF budget. And the thing that I've learned in my research is there's a very clear connection or very close connection and relationship between how much money a district is able to get from its capital budget, from either state aid or local bonds, and what it has to spend on M&O. So if you really are struggling to raise capital dollars, what that probably means, and we've showed that in other research, is that districts are having to pull dollars out of their, say, LCFF or operating funds to do repairs and other kinds of things. And those are always interesting to keep in mind. So let me jump to the findings of what we found. And yeah, so this pie chart is good. So the first main finding was that state aid has really declined substantially since 2005. What that meant was in the 10 years prior to that, locals were carrying about 50% of the expenditures, whereas it shifted over the latter years more recently to 65. And really that's been the drop in state aid. And there's been quite a discussion in Sacramento among lawmakers about, and Governor Brown has been fairly vocal on this, about how much the state should be in the business of assisting school districts with both new construction and modernization. And so the state aid dropped from 32% down to about 19 or 20%. And so the punchline here is that, okay, local districts and voters are really carrying a larger share of the responsibility for capital expenditures on their school facilities. And then the second main finding, which is really, you can go to the next slide if you would like, Ian, which is really on this first slide. Here's another articulation of that, which is that we found wide disparities in funding and money available to school districts that are really systematically very closely related to local property wealth, household income, and student background. And really, we found the same relationship between all three. Poorer communities on those various measures have raised less local dollars for the most part and gotten less in state aid. But what's interesting, if you go back to the first slide, if you don't mind, is that, remember I said there were two buckets, new construction and modernization. We actually found that the new construction approach that the state had was actually fairly equitable. Enrollment growth has been fairly equitably distributed across districts by different student types, et cetera. And those dollars have gone in an equitable way. It's on the modernization side where we see like the enormous inequity. So that's upgrading existing facilities. That's making sure they're healthy, they're safe, educationally adequate, they have technology, et cetera. What we find is in the modernization program, the slope of this graph, which is not what you want to see, was found on all of these various indicators that we looked at. Modernization funds from the state go disproportionately to wealthier districts than they do to lower income districts. So to close, you know, what really struck us was that it appears that the increased reliance on local funds for facilities construction and modernization has really appears to exacerbated inequalities in school facility revenues and finance. And this trend, appears to be counter to sort of the broader LCFF goals. And we do point to implications in terms of what the state role is. I think that the legislature and the new governor will certainly take this up, as they tend to do every few years, because this is largely money that's generated through local and statewide general obligation funds, which of course we all have to vote on. So lots of findings in the paper, but unfortunately this was the trend. But I think there are mechanisms on the table that can address this. And here you see a slope graph of the relationship between revenues raised and assessed value per pupil, which is property value, and local GO bonds revenue raised locally. So
great.
Thanks, Ann.